Boop, boop. No. Am I live? Am I live? It says excellent connection. I assume I must be live then. Do you hear me? Hello, YouTube. It's been a while. It's the first time that I'm... Oh, yeah. It does say that I'm live. Yes. Hello, YouTube, and welcome to Vanessa Júpiter's sitting room for the first Vanessa Júpiter reads that we've had in almost a year, I think. And tonight, I always say tonight. Actually, like, you know what? I'll give it a minute. I started a little bit early because I was setting up OBS. If someone wants to comment something on the chat, so I know that you are hearing me and that everything is okay. Right now it says excellent connection, but it also says zero viewers. So I guess that nobody can say anything. But up until like a minute ago, there were 2 viewers. Have I lost my audience? No, I'm joking. So yes, from what I understand, it should be working all okay. And if it isn't, we'll find out soon, I guess. Go live. Now I'm live. Now I'm live. Is that it? Good connection. I'm going to check this, like, given that nobody's waiting for me anyway. Hello, YouTube. So, as we are starting the live stream, Vanessa Júpiter reads for the first time in well over a year. I changed computers. I changed settings. I didn't change the hardware of the computer, but I did like reset everything about my computer. So it's like things are a little bit iffy on this end of things, so I'm not entirely sure if I'm live, or if everything is working as it should. So I'm trying to check. I'm trying to like log into this very live stream on my phone, and let's see if yes, look, I see myself, amazing, and I hear myself, so perfect. So hello, YouTube, for the 3rd time. For those watching it later, hello and welcome. This is Vanessa Júpiter Reads. This is a program that happens very, very irregularly. It will be happening again next week, actually. So after an almost year-long break, I have indeed I have indeed started doing the thing again, and I'll do the thing again soon. In case you don't know what Vanessa Júpiter Reads is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is the live stream where I read books or texts or whatever that I consider to be good, relevant, or both, and I talk about them. It's exactly what it sounds like. Vanessa Júpiter Reads. I am Vanessa Júpiter and I read. How fun. For tonight, I am reading something from Women Make Horror, this collection of essays edited by Alison Peirse, who has a newsletter. In case you have no idea who Alison Peirse is, this is a horror scholar with a newsletter. And yeah, like tonight we are reading about Hello! Can you see that I haven't done this in a while? So tonight we're reading about Freddy Krueger, and specifically the 6th Nightmare on Elm Street movie. So a little bit of background about this collection of essays. This is a collection of essays, not only, like, in theory, it's not about women writing about horror. It is about women who make horror. So it's horror movies made by women, whatever that means. And they have a broad definition of it. They have, there's an essay, for example, about Ginger Snaps, which was either written or co-written by a woman, and other essays where the important thing is that women have worked on these horror projects, and not necessarily as a director. There is a view of making a movie as a little broader than just this idea of the auteur, who is the director. In the case of the movie that we'll be talking about, which is The Final Nightmare, Freddy's Dead, which is this extremely campy horror movie, the 6th installment of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. In this case, the movie was indeed directed by a woman. So, yes. The title of the essay is The title of the essay is Self-Reflexivity. We're starting very well. Like, I practice reading these things. Like, I'm supposed to know how to say the words that I'm supposed to be reading because I practice it. And somehow, here we are. Self-Reflexivity and Feminist Camp in Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare by Tosha R. Taylor. The reason why I'm reading this is because I recently co-produced with my friend Harvey Rabbit, who was recently on this very channel, a movie that is very campy, titled Captain Fagatron Saves the Universe. So I have an interest in camp in general, and I have an interest in horror in general. So these things merging together made this essay into the one that I really wanted to read from the book. So I will. I will take a sip of my tea. I'll give everyone some time to message or comment on the chat if you want to say something. Please appreciate that I'm using natural light today. Every time that I use natural light, I'm like, can you believe that I'm using natural light? Like everything on this channel and everything in my drag is supposed to be artificial, but alas, here we are with the natural light. So yeah. Summer. So, without further ado, let's do this. Welcome to Vanessa Júpiter Reads Self-Reflexivity and Feminist Camp in Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. By Tosha R. Taylor. In her seminal essay, Notes on Camp, Susan Sontag writes that the essence of camp is its love of the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration. The Nightmare on Elm Street franchise has never shied away from camp, and the franchise's 6th installment, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare from 1991, expresses camp sensibilities to perhaps the greatest extent. The film undoubtedly owes its camp, at least in part, to the influence of its story creator and director, Rachel Talalay. As a production assistant on John Waters' Polyester from 1981 and producer on his Hairspray 1988 and Cry Baby from 1990, Talalay brings significant experience in camp filmmaking to her directorial debut. In addition, her work as a production manager on A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original from 1984, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, and as a producer on A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, also provides an aesthetic and stylistic foundation for her work on the 6th film. This style offers a conspicuous self-reflexivity by which the film's own narrative devices, particularly those based in humor, suggest a metatextual awareness of the film franchise. Camp and self-reflexivity then merge in the film Freddy's Dead, which, finally, albeit temporarily, kills Freddy Krueger. In the late addition to the A Nightmare on Elm Street series may challenge the identification of to whom the film belongs, especially as Talele has not directed other films within the franchise. While, as Annette Kuhn notes, literal ownership of a film frequently seems to belong to corporate entities, the history of auteur demonstrates a cultural and critical tendency to treat films as belonging to their directors. The opening credits of Freddy's Dead establish an element of ownership for Talele. The fourth title card identifies a Rachel Talele film. And Talele receives further visual credits as director and creator of the story on which the film is based. Freddy's Dead arguably presents a complex case for evaluating Talele's role as a distinctly feminist director or even an auteur. Yet, while the primary of the auteur has long positioned the director as the author of a film, filmmaking remains a collaborative art form. Talele created the story outline but has openly credited the film's screenwriter Michael DeLuca with transforming a previous screenwriter's initial unsatisfactory script. Her acknowledgement of the screenplay's multiple authors confounds our urge to recognize the hand of a female author in this film while demonstrating a greater appreciation for the collaborative process. So, quick pause. This is something that is often widely discussed, debated on, and discoursed on Twitter about, who does the movie belong to, blah, 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 and the author theory about, who is the author of a movie? Is it the director? Always. Is it always the director? Is it the writers and everything? And this is something that I was mentioning just before we started. And here it's coming back as, we should all take a second to acknowledge that film is a collaborative process, even if we acknowledge that the hand of someone in particular, often the director, is going to weigh a little heavier than others, which is fine. It's fine. Talele was not the only woman directing horror in the 1980s and early 90s, but she is the only woman to direct an Elm Street film. Given that the franchise deploys the final girl trope so consistently, the presence of a female filmmaker adds another layer of meaning for feminist examinations of the film. Talele's formative experiences on camp films further encourages us to ask questions about the relationship between gender, filmmaking, and camp. This chapter thus explores camp in Freddy's Dead to investigate how the franchise's singular woman director negotiates discourses of women's agency, trauma, and spectatorial engagement within a pre-existing horror mythos. I argue here that Talele employs camp humor and self-reflexivity to wield power over the franchise itself. Camp has undergone several, sometimes contradictory, critical treatments in efforts to definitively qualify it. For my purposes, I undertake Sontag's initial characterizations of camp as a starting point, which a concession that Sontag, as others have pointed out, For my purposes, I undertake Sontag's initial characterizations of camp as a starting point, with the concession that Sontag, as others have pointed out, errs in dismiss camp's politics, working too from Sontag's distinguishing of camp from kitsch on the grounds that kitsch lacks the love of exaggeration integral to camp. This chapter is also informed by David McGregor Johnson's argument that while camp is capable of making fun of itself, kitsch can only be made fun of. Freddy most conspicuously invites the camp label. His crude humor invites the viewer to laugh at his victims' terror, to cringe without empathy at their bodily destruction, and to enjoy horror narratives that seem increasingly less designed to frighten. Freddy himself is an exaggeration. His burn scars are clearly prosthetic, and his hand is augmented by a home-modified glove with blade for fingers. As he attacks his victims, he transforms his own body to the point of inhuman deformation. In the first film, his mouth becomes the mouthpiece of a phone in Nancy's dream, and in the third film, he transforms into a giant snake to devour Kristen. Casey Ryan Kelly characterizes camp horror as having low production values, exaggerated depictions of the grotesque, preposterous death and dismemberments, detached humor, and conscious deployment of generic tropes. While the majority of the franchise revels in such elements, Tellele's Editions offers the most camp self-reflexivity up until the 7th installment. Dreams blend seamlessly with reality in all the films, but this one rarely ventures into reality, instead offering up dreams within dreams within dreams. Rather than being tangential to the main plot, as for instance Joey's death in the third film, these nested dreams drive some of the narrative action. Okay, I'm going to reread this final sentence because I stumbled upon it. Rather than being tangential to the main plot, as for instance Joey's death in the third film, these nested dreams drive some of the narrative action. Just a little note on like the exaggerated features of Freddy's scars. I also want to bring up that the sixth film and the second film were the ones that I found like the heavy focusing on the scarrings of Freddy's face, like the most unnerving, I guess, in the sense of like feeling like the movie really wanted us to feel either grossed out or frightened by the scars, which I don't particularly like. And yeah, the sixth film like is mentioned here that they are clearly prosthetic, and yeah, it's true, they are clearly prosthetic in the sixth film, and I do appreciate the artificiality of it in the sixth film, but I still feel like it went a little too far into the like, look at these gross scars, which yeah, meh. Harvey and I talked a bunch about the representation of facial scars in film in the previous video that is right here on the channel about Nightmare on Elm Street representation and camp. Johnston writes that kitsch horror films, and he includes the Elm Street sequels here, are frightening, but generally they are frightening in ways that do not challenge us to question these films, our responses to them, or the worlds they represent. While Freddy's death is less conventionally frightening, it does invite the viewer to question all previous thoughts and assumptions about the franchise. Its value as a horror film, as a horror sequel, and as an example of camp lies less in visual realizations and more in Tellele's amendments to the mythology of the franchise. Perhaps the boldest of Tellele's decisions is a retcon of Freddy's origin story. The franchise had established Freddy as a child killer who was, in turn, killed by the parents of his victims when the justice system failed them. Tellele's retcon imagines him as a perversion of the quintessential family man, living comfortably in a middle-class house with a wife and young daughter. The terrifying boiler room, established in previous films as the location of Freddy's crimes, is now reworked as a hidden room within the Krueger family cellar. Human Freddy plays in his garden with his daughter, and suggestions of his evil intentions come only from the spectator's awareness of his crimes. The retcon also removes some of Freddy's own power over his supernatural existence. Rather than leaving the audience to assume that Freddy's dream world resurrection occurs as a result of his own evil, the film establishes that he drew the attention of three demons, called the Dream People, by Freddy, and the Snake Demons in the film's ending credits. These demons appear to be human Freddy and promise that These demons appear to human Freddy and promise that if Freddy allows them to enter him, he shall be forever. It is their will, not Freddy's, that allows his soul to live on after he is burned to death. And when he dies at the end of the film, they unceremoniously depart. Freddy's reliance on the dream people arguably transports him and the franchise to a new level of camp exaggeration. It goes from being a narrative about a dead murderer who manifests in teenagers' dreams to kill them in real life to becoming retroactively a narrative about a dead murderer who manages to do so because he is possessed by 3 crudely animated demons. However, Freddy's Dead cannot be labeled as pure camp, which, according to Sontag, is always naive rather than intentional. Such camp emerges from a seriousness that fails rather than a deliberate construction of camp, which Sontag does not find to be the most truly camp form. Yet, just as Sontag concedes that failing seriousness is not always camp, not all camp can be held to this standard. Indeed, many, if not most, modern horror films described as camp would not deserve the label under such strict criteria. Nonetheless, by Sontag's and Johnston's respective definitions, the film's deliberate camp risks banishing it to kitsch. Okay, so the conversation about intentionality. So Susan Sontag, who was like one of the main people to talk about camp, defines camp as, or not define, but like says that one important characteristic of camp is its unintentionality, which I have talked about this before already. Like, I think that putting intentionality as one of the main axes of definition of anything really in film is often a bad idea, because we like I'm not for necessarily not paying attention to what the director did or didn't do or said or didn't say about the films that they produced. I'm not fully on board with the idea of death of the author, but I do think that for genre, for analysis of like where a film falls, it is often so difficult to use intentionality as a metric that I think it's often unfruitful. I'll say that. So that to say, as much as I obviously think that there is room for discussion of intentionality, obviously, I think that focusing on it too much is often to the detriment of discourse about camp. In my personal, I was going to say humble opinion, but like me being humble, lol. So one element that preserves Freddy's Dead camp status is its. Let me take a breath before I continue. I feel like I just started it and like did not give you any time to like remember that this is a live reading. One element that preserves Freddy's Dead camp status is its deployment of artifice and representation. Indeed, representation is a crucial element of camp and the franchise as a whole. Sontag writes that camp sees everything in quotation marks. It is not a lamp, but a lamp. Oh my god. Not a woman, but a woman. To perceive camp in objects as persons is to understand being as playing a role. Okay, I'm going to like reread this quote by Susan Sontag because it is indeed like one of the quotes that to me makes the most sense whenever talking about camp, and the quote that I always fall back to because it is the quote that makes me understand everything. So I'll read it again so like we all pay attention to it. Camp sees everything in quotation marks. It's not a lamp, but a lamp. Not a woman, but a woman. To perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. Here you go. Susan Sontag. Throughout the franchise, Freddy takes the form of a multitude of people and objects as he torments his victims. That he does so in their dreams allows such transformations to become truly outlandish. Talele's film privileges such artificial representations. In Carlos's dream, For instance, the device attached to his ear is not a hearing aid, but a painful, moving flesh augmentation in the guise of a hearing aid. The woman he sees as his mother is actually Freddy taking on the form of his mother. As will be discussed in more detail later, actor Roseanne Barr is not truly a character called Ethel, but is rather Roseanne Barr as Ethel, just as musician Alice Cooper is not playing Freddy's foster father so much as he is Alice Cooper as Freddy's foster father. The film owes some of its focus on artifice to its self-reflexivity. Carol Clover finds self-reflexivity particularly evident in the horror genre, and Jeffrey Sconce argues that its conspicuousness in Freddy's Dead. At all times, unlike its predecessors, Freddy's Dead is conspicuously aware of itself. While Talele's film is not unique in its engagement with self-aware camp, it is perhaps the most self-aware at this point in the franchise. Zontag places a camp value on lists of allegedly bad films due to an abundance of fans who can be counted on to see such films in a high-spirited and unpretentious way. Such viewers have expectations around the typical quality and narrative conventions of these films and bring these expectations to the viewing experience. Freddy's Dead assumes the spectator is already familiar with the previous franchise installments. Even as it partly reconfigures Freddy's origin, a feat that allows for wholly new viewers to better follow his demise, it invites the franchise fan to notice its idiosyncrasies and to be surprised by the revelation of Freddy's daughter and by the insertion of literal demonic forces as the sources of Freddy's power. Thus, they are made to re-examine the character they have believed they understood since his initial appearance. The film welcomes the viewer to share in its self-mockery. In one particular scene, gamer Spencer awakens in the dream world of a game and proceeds to travel through its two-dimensional plane. He eventually comes to a boss fight with an avatar of his abusive father and then, once having defeated him, to the game's avatar of Freddy. Outside the game and beyond Spencer's awareness, but still within the dream world, Freddy himself controls the game. To Talele's expressed consternation, 3D sequences were meant to be one of the film's selling points, but the film makes a clear effort to reproduce 8-bit graphics to insert a live-action Spencer into them. The cheesy sounds of the game and Spencer's exaggerated movements occur in two screens: Freddy's television as Dream Spencer progresses through the game and the screen on which the audience watches the film as the sleeping Spencer sleepwalks and jumps through the house. To a contemporary audience, the graphics of Spencer's dream are unquestionably of low quality, yet we cannot dismiss them as simply a product of their time. Freddy's assessment of great graphics, spoken only to the spectator, fully reveals the camp self-mockery of the scene. Robert Englund's makeup and prostheses create a far better embodiment of special effects and elevate the joke's self-awareness further. In contrast to both the ridiculous visual of Spencer superimposed over cheap video game graphics and gory disfigurements, the camp with which Zontag is concerned exaggerates beautiful features. The hallmark of camp is the spirit of extravagance. Yet, this may be translated into an exaggeration of the conventions of horror in discussions of the genre. We can locate such a translation in the doubling of persons and embedding of dreams within dreams in Freddy's Dead. As with many of the film elements discussed in this chapter, Freddy's Dead is not only the film in the franchise to embed dreams, indeed, the disorienting transgressions of the boundaries between the waking and the dreaming worlds are integral to each film's tensions. Talele's installment, however, deploys this element to the point of self-aware ridiculousness. John experiences recurring dreams of a house that is lifted into the air. Early in the film, the dream references The Wizard of Oz. an accidental camp classic, as Freddy appears as the Wicked Witch. Later, instead of hovering over the town of Springwood, the house flies all the way into outer space. John wakes from one dream to the next so many times that he ceases to be frightened by the experience. In one such dream sequence, knowing from previous dreams that it is only when he rises from his bed that Freddy will attack, John proclaims that nothing can make him leave the bed, at which point the bed unceremoniously catches fire. John reacts with exasperation rather than fear. Here, the film nods to the audience, whom it knows is equally familiar with such tropes and perhaps equally bored of them. The thing of waking up, dream within a dream within a dream. I actually found John's dream sequence, like the early dream sequence that this passage of the text is referring to, where he's falling and waking up and falling and waking up and falling and waking up multiple times. Very relatable. I've had a dream like that when I was a teenager. My dreams nowadays are not as exciting, but when I was a teenager, I would have like dreams where I would wake up and like still be dreaming. And this of like dying multiple times is one that I had at least one time. I think I had it more times, honestly, so. Celebrity cameos are also employed in a self-reflexive and camp manner. Just as Lily credits John Waters as an influence on her filmmaking approach, she suggests her work on Cry Baby guided her decision to include multiple celebrity cameos in Freddy's Dead. When Maggie and the teens arrive in Springwood Town Fair, Tracy, Carlos, and Spencer are soon accosted by a couple, portrayed by Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold. Crybaby star and Elm Street veteran Johnny Depp cameos in an anti-drug commercial. Rock star Alice Cooper appears in a flashback as Freddy's abusive foster father. Finally, Iggy Pop sings over the film's ending credits, explicitly referencing Freddy in the song's lyrics. While a cameo is not inherently camp, those appearing in Freddy's Dead boast an undeniable camp value. Roseanne Barr provides the only female and arguably most camp cameo. While she has marred her contemporary reputation with problematic political remarks, at the time of Talili's film, Barr was known as a comedian and actor, often in roles that evoked camp sensibilities. For the record, as someone who is not a US American and who like did not have access to stuff like Roseanne Show or something, Roseanne Show, like I only ever heard of Roseanne Barr when when people started talking about how conservative she had become or something like that. Like I only know Roseanne Barr because of controversy. So like so like I have no context for this person being like decent. Speaking of controversy, like another person who was one of the cameos was Johnny Depp, and allow me to not enter that, but yeah, like watching stuff from the 80s and thinking, ooh, people that had very different like public personas at the time, how interesting. So back to Roseanne Barr and what Tosha R. Taylor has to say about her cameo. Popularly considered authentic in her portrayal of a working-class wife and mother on her sitcom, Barr embodied the fat female who is not embarrassed by being what social propaganda describes as physically unacceptable and even more disconcerting, who flaunts her sexuality. Furthermore, she was at the time considered a disruptive figure who stood in opposition to bourgeois and feminist standards of decorum. Her brashness, irreverence, and refusal to apologize for her anti-hegemonic appearance made her prone to media criticism, but also imbued her with great potential for camp value. And she had indeed already engaged in self-awareness camp performance prior to her Freddy's Dead cameo. Although parenthood is already the main theme in Freddy's Dead, Barr's performance as deranged mother Ethel lies at an extreme in Barr's pre-existing performance trajectory. Barr's cameo is a camp embodiment of a doting mother. She speaks to the three teenagers as if they are small children, touching their faces and promising that if they go home with her, she will protect them from an unnamed male figure. Just before she is interrupted by her husband, she gets the teens' noses, continuing in a parodic display of motherhood. Together, the two appear more as buffoons than grieving parents, yet their antics receive a grotesque gloss that discourages outright comedy. The teens do not yet know the legend of Freddy Krueger, but the audience realizes he is the nameless evil the couple fears, the cause of their children's death, and the reason for the town's trauma. The appearance of two celebrity comedians as the only grieving parents imbues the scene with the security of camp, while the film navigates a plot more explicitly centered on child abuse than its predecessors. Depp's cameo also occurs within a camp context. While, like Bars, Depp's current reputation is far less positive than it once was, he also brings a camp gloss to the film. He had already suffered a dramatic death in the franchise's first installment and had, at the time of filming, recently performed in Cry Baby and Edward Scissorhands. Depp's cameo is limited to an appearance in Spencer's Dream, in which he recreates a low-quality anti-drug advertisement. Once the audience has had time to recognize him and hear the obligatory line, Freddy disposes of him by hitting him in the head with a frying pan. Where Bars and Arnold's cameo provide some advancement to the plot, Depp's simply functions as a proverbial wink to the viewer and, in the case of fans of the franchise, an in-group communique. Look at me winking at the audience. Indeed, humorous self-awareness and cameos provide an appreciable, if at times kitschy, horror comedy foundation for the film. Through such casting decisions, Freddy's Dead celebrates its own engagement with low culture. It reminds us of what it is and continuously reveals it knows what it is. Where consideration of camp must become more nuanced, however, is in the film's treatment of its more disturbing subject matter. Sexual abuse is an underlying narrative of much of the franchise, and critics have explored readings of Freddy as a substitute villain for actual incest being committed against teen protagonists. David Kingsley, for instance, argues that Freddy is a doppelganger for Nancy's father. However, unlike its first film's eventual remake in 2010, the original franchise largely maintained the theme of child molestation as an undercurrent. Character's consistent failure to say what specifically Freddy did to the children of Elm Street allows for the continued oppression of the community's youth, unaware of the forces that threaten them. Freddy's Dead, however, explicitly acknowledges childhood sexual assault and incest in the waking world. Rather than preventing the film from engaging with such dark themes, its camp sensibilities fulfill the metaphorical contract of Freddy Krueger films while challenging fans' enjoyment of the character. Sontag reminds us that despite its humor, camp may concern grave matters. Freddy Spun's one-liners and sight gags turn the franchise's films into comedy horror at times, and his humor is so intrinsic to his violence that Scott argues he may be the real hero whose victory the audience wishes to see. Because the franchise avoids explicitly identifying Freddy as a pedophile, fans may enjoy his jokes and over-the-top violence without seeming to delight in fictional sexual abuse. Talali's film compromises this comfort, emphasizing both camp humor and exaggeration and the truth of Freddy's sexual crimes. His pithy remarks are then placed in juxtaposition with the audience's increasing knowledge. In a bright, colorful flashback, humor is transformed into fear when Maggie plays with Freddy in the garden. While he does not threaten her, danger is present when he crouches to extend his hands to her. Loretta's scream and subsequent emergence from the cellar simply redirect the growing dread from daughter to mother. As we hear Freddy's grunts as he kills Loretta above ground, Maggie wanders into the dark space where her father abuses children. Her tearful childhood promise, "I won't tell," echoes her mother's plea and conspicuously mirrors common experiences of childhood sexual assault victims. A similar challenge to the usual fan enjoyment of Freddy occurs when he impersonates Tracy's father in her dreams and tries to molest her. It is clear that Tracy's reactions that Freddy's interpretation of her father as a sexually abusive man is an accurate one. Thus, we realize that Freddy is revisiting trauma upon a teenage victim of incest. Tracy's memory of her own father adds a discomforting potential for sexual threat in Maggie's connection to Freddy, one that was missing from Freddy's interactions with John. Something that I really find super interesting whenever there is a blend of either comedy or camp with horror is like I mention this all the time that I watch so many extreme disturbing movies like that have no shred of like fun or humor in them, that are like feel bad movies. I watch so many of them, and so often the movies and scenes that get to me the most are scenes that from movies that are campier and funnier, because like the contrast makes me so disturbed. Like I often talk about how much the one of the early kills, the one in the movie theater in Scream 2, affected me. Something that I mentioned a little bit less often is that the parody of that kill in the first Scary Movie, which is a parody and it's supposed to be a comedy, it's supposed to be funny, it's supposed to be a big joke where someone is killed in a movie theater. I also find that deeply disturbing, and I do think that the comedy paired with like something that I find disturbing often will make me more disturbed. And in the context of Freddy's dad, the scene that Tosha R Taylor refers to here in the flashback showing Freddy as a father is actually, like, I would definitely qualify it as one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire franchise. One of the hardest scenes to watch for sure. And it is right stuck in the middle of the movie that is arguably the least or the most horror comedy of all the first 6 movies. So, okay. Time to start talking about, feminism and women directing. This is not to say, of course, that the seriousness of childhood sexual assault is to be expected in the work of a female filmmaker taking control of the Elm Street narrative. However, we would be remiss to overlook the fact that the only film in the franchise that explicitly incorporates sexual abuse into its narrative is the only one with a woman director. In doing so, we naturally come to consider the possibility of a feminist approach to the film's treatment of its subject matter. Does Tellele's invocation of camp and deployment of 2 final girls necessarily make her film feminist? This is an unexpected question, one often posed in regard to women's filmmaking as a whole. The mere presence of a female director does not necessarily equate a feminist approach to filmmaking, and critics have sought to unpack how, precisely, we may locate the film director within larger historical and theoretical contexts. Certainly, too, might we typically expect the franchise's only female director to place a feminist gloss on her installment, especially when the series itself has been so concerned with the victimization of women and vulnerable youth? Tellele has linked horror to the feminist movement of the time. I'm going to be part of this revolution, where I do whatever I think is right, and I'm not going to be stopped. So when horror came along and horror was cool, I did horror. Her decision does not satisfy desires to see women working in the genre out of sheer love for it, but it does point towards a deliberate feminist context for her tenure on the franchise and especially her story and direction. We can, therefore, seek a feminist reading of the film, especially within the context of a male-dominated genre. An initial feminist subversion occurs in the film's negotiation of Maggie's place within the youth shelter. When she and Tracy return from Springwood, they find that Freddy has somehow erased the memories of other characters so that they forget their dead friends. Maggie's boss interprets her insistence on the boy's existence as a sign of fatigue, mirroring the frequent dismissal of women's concerns both within the medical industry and in their own professional spheres. Tracy's traumatized response are at times dismissed or overlooked. Both women's cases parallel the circumstances in which previous women of Elm Street have been written off as tired, mentally unstable, or paranoid. Jonathan Markovitz acknowledges that horror may challenge presumptions of female paranoia by establishing it as a reasonable response to a world that is hostile to women, but also finds such critiques of this implicit societal misogyny to be blunted when the final girl's paranoia is revealed as delusional after all. Other films within the franchise do at times fail to challenge such presumptions. Freddy is, after all, primarily limited to the dream world. Freddy's Dead, however, centers on the realistic traumas of child abuse that occur prior to Freddy's arrival in characters' dreams. With the exception of John, whose amnesia remains until his death, all the principal characters in the film have been tormented by flesh and blood people close to them before they encounter Freddy in the dreamscape. Yet, the film does not go as far as we might perhaps like. Freddy is not made to reckon with his crimes, rather he dies with a joke, addressing the spectator directly as he mutters, "Kids!" inviting the viewer to once more share in his humor. The film ends with Maggie happily saying, "Freddy's dead!" But we are left to imagine what that means for her. So too are we left to imagine what, if any, effect these events will have on Tracy's trauma. That Freddy also suffered in life is made clear. When Maggie pulls Freddy out into the waking world, he pleads with her. "It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't. You saw what they did to me." Sorry. I don't know how to do impressions. Yet, while this literally rehumanized Freddy calls for sympathy and tells the truth about his own murder, he remains nightmarish. He still wears his signature glove, his hand hidden behind his back, thus revealing the threat he still poses to Maggie. As Camp doesn't reverse things or argue that good is bad or the bad is good, she cannot accept Freddy's trauma as justification for his crimes. It is then satisfying to see her use the glove to kill him, particularly due to Camp appropriation of the franchise's iconic fetish object. In this way, too, Maggie challenges the patriarchal order that Freddy represents. Freddy is not a serious character. Although his actions have serious ramifications, Sontag ultimately finds that the whole point of Camp is to dethrone the serious, often through the frivolous. As his daughter, Maggie is the ideal agent to depose Freddy, and her adoption of his glove as a weapon against him establishes her as an heir to his proverbial throne. A role she shirks once he is dead. She lives out the final girl revenge fantasy by briefly tormenting her tormentor, her father, who may or may not have abused her, but about whom she has certainly repressed dark memories. Then, however, she simply walks away from the scene, rendering Freddy's dethronement a frivolous act that at the same time successfully defeats a serious monster. It is likely that some of the film's visually camp qualities were the result of financial limitations rather than directorial choice. Talele has openly expressed disappointment in some areas of the film, such as its more lackluster special effects, and has also wondered if it was a mistake to go the humorous tongue-in-cheek route with Freddy, instead of full-on horror. Yet, she has followed such questions with an assurance that the film was, for all its flaws, a response to how predictable horror had become. The film then requires the franchise and its viewers to engage in new ways with familiar content. That this is largely achieved through camp imbues the film with a critically overlooked value that warrants further consideration of its place in feminist filmmaking. Analysis of the film with regard to its maker causes us to consider how, precisely, we locate Lily within this work. Considering women film directors within a feminist framework requires additional efforts not to simply add them to discussions of a male-dominated medium. When women are recognized as makers within the horror genre, they are frequently regarded with contradictory tendencies that regard them as valuable feminist voices while lambasting them for engaging in the tropes and imagery of a genre frequently accused of being misogynistic. Women directors making horror films thus come to the genre already burdened with the pressures of conflicting and extensive expectations. Lily's acknowledgement of the collaborative nature of filmmaking may challenge attempts to credit her as a creator or even auteur in this case. However, while her story was not the only one considered for the film's narrative, her outline was chosen. An outline that replaced the male hero with a female one. Women viewers might especially take pleasure in Lily's bait-and-switch replacement of John with Catherine as Freddy's true heir and the film's hero. In this way, Lily participates in the rewriting of the male-dominated cultural script that is so historically significant to women filmmaking. This does not itself necessarily impose a feminist value on the film, but it does offer such possibilities for the viewer to do so. Indeed, Jane Gaines cautions us not to overlook the audience as another contributor to a film's meaning. One of the richest areas in which we may find feminist values lies in Lily's own irreverence towards the film. As discussed earlier, she has openly addressed the film's flaws and has expressed ambivalence about her and her collaborators' approach to the film as a whole. She has also expressed the lack of decision-making power in the film's editing for television and DVD releases. And her similar candor in these admissions further reminds us of a director's limitations. We may thus retrospectively see the frank self-awareness of the film as a reflection of her directing philosophy. Perhaps the greatest instance to enable such a reading occurs in the inclusion of Iggy Pop's "Why Was I Born? Freddy's Dead" over the end credits. The final lyrics pose the cynical question, "You think Freddy's dead? You really think Freddy's dead?" Lily reveals that this was not initially planned challenge to the film, but says, "It's so ballsy that we kept that. It's like our own fuck you to ourselves, I think." Tasked with the film that would kill Freddy Krueger, Lily had the opportunity to create a definitive conclusion to a franchise, albeit within the parameters imposed by the studio. Iggy Pop's song contradicts Lily's own conclusion, but her allowance of it as the final word on the film demonstrate a bold anti-auteur. Sorry, I'm going to reread this. Iggy Pop's song contradicts Lily's own conclusion, but her allowance of it as the final word on the film demonstrate a bold anti-auteur choice that may even increase the film's self-reflexive camp. Ultimately, while Lily is not the mythological ideal of the feminist horror director simultaneously sought after and condemned by critics, she nonetheless positions herself as an appropriate place of refreshing authenticity. Thank you. So this was Self-Reflexivity and Feminist Camp in Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed this text quite a lot. I think that it's one of the things that I like about not only this one essay, but also a lot of other essays in this collection, that they're well written, like as film analysis for like I think that they're very like I know that there's a lot of debate as to like how much uh, how accessible like academic texts should or shouldn't be in the context of non-academics. I'm not an academic myself, and so I appreciate whenever like texts manage to be interesting to me as a non-academic, as someone who has never formally studied film. Uh, Many of the texts in Women Make Horror are such, and I think that they are very like I appreciate this one in particular because it is talking about camp, which is something that I'm interested on, but I watch very little film that doesn't fall within the horror genre. So I end up not watching a whole lot of camp, even though like I am interested in it. Um, like my engagement with camp ends up being a lot more within the drag world because like I I am a drag queen after all, and I do exist in drag spaces and such. So I end up like knowing more about camp through that than I do through film because because I don't watch a whole lot of film that isn't horror, and so I know camp like so getting to understand camp through a horror lens was very useful for me. I feel like yeah, I can like I have seen enough John Waters to like get an understanding of that, but as soon as like the points of reference become others, sometimes it becomes a little more complicated because I lack a lot of the reference that is needed. And when it comes to Freddy, I know Freddy. Even before having watched the movie, when I read the essay, I hadn't seen Freddy's dad specifically, but I understand the language of Freddy and Freddy Krueger. Like in a way, like this is a point of reference that I find a lot easier to connect to. So this is one of the big reasons why I was so attracted to this essay actually. Like I think it's a good like way to engage with camp horror, Freddy Krueger, everything. I think it's just like neat. I think the essay is very very neat. So I really like it. It is relevant to my current life because again, I have a movie that is in post production right now. That is a camp movie. It's not a horror movie. It's a camp superhero film that I produced, and that it is currently in post production. I'm going to add the information about it on the description. Written, directed, and co-produced by Harvey Rabbit. And yeah, I'm going to add all of the information about this movie on the description as well. It was a big motivator for me to be interested in this and doing this live reading today. And I guess that since this is a live streaming, I think it's a good time to do some housekeeping on the channel. Is it? Ugh, I think so. So. Yeah, like I like the idea of having more than just one video coming out about a subject, and this is what I tried to do 2 months ago as well, when I did the video on Sunset Boulevard and whatever happened to Baby Jane, and then I immediately also put out the video about exploitation. I really like this format of having two videos, for example, right now about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, one reading and one discussion, and and I would like to like just because my brain, I would like to keep like months fixed for each thing, and I've already even mentioned on this channel at least one time that I've been going through like a big vampire phase, and next week, on Thursday, no, what day is it today? Yes, on Thursday the 1st. I don't know the time yet. I think it's going to be at 20 o'clock Central European time, Berlin time, my time. 20 o'clock, I believe, maybe 21 to be confirmed. I'm going to come to the channel to read Carmilla. I need to reread it first and make sure, like, I think that there might be a couple of slurs that I might have to, contemplate what I'm going to do about. Like, I remember the thing is that I considered doing Dracula, and I know that Dracula has a bunch of slurs that I would feel uncomfortable saying on the channel, but we'll see. I'll reread Carmilla, and then I'll decide what I do with it. But in any case, in a week, I will be reading at the very least parts of Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. I would love to read the whole thing. It is a lot longer than most texts that I've read in one sitting on this channel, but I would indeed really, really love to actually just do the whole thing. Just do the whole damn thing. In any case, it will be posted on the channel as usual, like a few days in advance at the very least. I'll probably put up like the event in a couple of days. And with that, I really want to do something with the amount of vampire stuff that I watched recently, because I did watch a lot of vampire movies recently, and maybe I do want to do something with that. Besides just reading Carmilla, there are some special treats for all of us, possibly coming in the vampire sense. But this is what's going on the channel. I'm liking the idea of having like a month dedicated to each thing whenever I get to do videos. I'm still managing to always upload at least once a month, which sometimes it's difficult, and like soon enough it's possible that the channel will just mostly become uploads of previous performances of mine. But for now, so far so good. I also, one other thing about housekeeping. One of the reasons why this channel is titled Vanessa Júpiter's Sitting Room and not something related to horror or to film specifically is because I lose myself in things other than things. So I like the idea of having the channel being open to whatever it is that I'm going through at the moment. And I'm at a point in my life right now where it's pretty much impossible for me to concentrate on watching films or TV shows, especially on my own. So I haven't been. I haven't been watching any movies or TV shows, which is fine. I'm not like worried about that in any level, but it also means that I'm less inclined to do videos about film. And given that film is something that I understand a little bit better than most other things, it could mean that there might be a hiatus coming, because often I know what I want to say if I want to talk about a movie. And if I don't have a movie to talk about because I have not been passionate about movies for a while, then it becomes complicated to want to say to make a video. There might be a hiatus coming soon is basically what I'm saying. We'll see. And yeah, for you, I think that's all the housekeeping. I think that's all the. I think that I made most of the comments that I wanted to make about the text while I was reading it, and the final few paragraphs I didn't make any comments specific about it besides saying that I liked them. Mostly because I just like them. I just agree with them. I just think it's a good text. As I said, I think it's a very neat text. I'm very happy to have read it. And I hope whoever watches this enjoys, hearing me read it. I think I'm really happy that with my reading style nowadays, I think that I have become a much better reader since I started the channel. And of course, because I did it a bunch when I started the channel. Please tell me whatever it is that you want to tell me on the comments. Leave me your thoughts, theories, contemplations, and comments. And I will see you all soon, next week, for Carmilla. Vanessa Júpiter reads Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Aren't we so excited? I'm so excited. Look at me being so excited about being a vampire again. With that, always remember and never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye. End stream.